Finnegans Wake is, amongst many things, a celebration of the divergent capacities of the reader to bring their own conceptions, tactics, methods, and tools to the text in order to get something unique out of it every time, such that the text and the reader are component parts of a larger aesthetic process, which is not ideal but imminent, a process of discovering random heaps of information in a midden heap, as it's put early in Finnegans Wake, where we actually see a hen reconstructing a letter that is told throughout Finnegans Wake and trying to redeem HCE's fallenness through the creative capacity to take seemingly unmeaningful information from the refuse of the past and from the current stuff we just ignore and turning it into something interesting. And one of the ways Joyce plays on this aspect in the text is through accents and orthophonetics, as he calls it. That is, phonetics concerning the relationship between speaking and orthography, or the actual layout of the words on the page, the way that they appear, the way they're spelled, and whatnot. And I think this is really interesting because one of the things that's always been really important for me as I approach Finnegans Wake is recitation, because I love to teach, and thus I love to put information about Finnegans Wake online as I am here, and that requires that I read some of the passages and recite them, performing them, and taking the otherwise stale text on the page and turning it into something living and breathing through my own body. And Finnegans Wake is very much embodied. I mean, physically, it is an embodied text with its own textual body, but also it takes on its own conceptual frame, its own non-human persona as we approach it and we continually recursively interpret it. And in this lecture, I would like to show some examples where Joyce plays around with accents and works at the interstices of language to show, for example, all of the orthographic particularities of English due to its history of being mediated through various new tongues that come in and out of the history of the English language. And by doing so, we'll see how he takes an otherwise normal English novel and just accentuates it with not only a number of different languages, but a number of different accents. And accent is really important because it bears on Finnegans Wake as a text of bodily performance, one that is irrevocably individual as its own text, but also always being individuated by the reader and reciter. As we open up Finnegans Wake, we find ourselves in medias res amidst HCE's fall, as he tries to pick up the pieces and as the text itself tries to put together the pieces of what has already happened, what is happening, and what is to happen in the future. And we get a sort of promise that Finnegan will rise again, but said in a very particular sort of faux Eastern European, kind of Romanian accent. Ho, 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 Mr. Finn, you're going to be Mr. Finn again. Come de morning, oh, your wine. Sundays even, ah, your vinegar. Ha, 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 Mr. Fun, you're going to be fined again. And he uses various stuff on the page to signal this accent, such as, oh, your vine, instead of fine, and vinegar, which I still don't exactly know what that's supposed to be referring to. But we can see that he's actually trying to orthographically represent the accent on the page such that we don't leave English. We're not speaking another language. We're just taking these other languages and bearing them on English, which is really important because Finnegans Wake is a properly Irish text trying to displace the authority of the English canon, for example, of what is considered proper speech. This is a very suspect category for Joyce, and he does a great deal to infuse the Irish accent in Finnegans Wake. And thus, I've always found it really important when reciting it to try to put on an Irish accent of my own, because oftentimes the spelling facilitates using an Irish accent and actually is aided by doing such. And if I bring my American accent to the text, sometimes I miss certain things. But a really good practice that I found, and kind of the inspiration for this lecture, is oftentimes I will be reading various German or French texts, and I'll come to Finnegans Wake, and I'll still be in that German or French mindset. And I always try to read Finnegans Wake aloud, and I will just sit down and I will experiment reading whatever passage I happen to be reading in that accent. And irrevocably and ineluctably, I find a new connection just because I put on this different accent. And that, in fact, Joyce is constantly shifting between a multitudinous array of accents in single sentences, in single compound words, in such a way that it actively requires the reader's experimental aesthetic attitude to be brought to the text, such that you can actually team out all of these various times, right? Teams of times and happy returns is one of the more famous quotes in Finnegans Wake. So I found that when I put on the Irish accent, sometimes I find interesting things. Sometimes when I keep my American accent, I find things. When I put on a Canadian accent or a Spanish accent or a German accent, whatever it may be, I find that there are always unique conceptual strands and phonetic strands that I can follow, and I can see them being traced out on the page. ALP says in her final monologue in Book 4, "Is there one who understands me?" And this idea of understanding is put in critical relief across Finnegans Wake. But one of my favorite and funny instances of this, which bears directly on our discussion of accents and languages and phonetics here, is in the Mutt and Jute dialogue, which occurs in the first chapter of the first book of Finnegans Wake. And this is a very interesting kind of contestation between two male characters, Mutt and Jute. And there's a play on the idea of being mute, of being unable to speak in here. And they constantly seem to be talking past each other. They're shifting accents and frames of reference. And just before the actual dialogue starts, where we get the dialogue format on the page, it goes as follows. "'Scuse us, Charlie Guy. Je taler det dansk? Je tager det Schweden? Je spager i Anglis? Je fonio Saxo? Clear also, 'tis a jute. Let us swap hats and exchange a few strong verbs, weak arch each other, yap yazard abast the bloody creeks." Right, so he's trying to ask him, does he speak Dutch or Danish? Does he speak Swedish? Does he speak English? Does he speak Saxon? And he just keeps responding, just this guttural, just can't even form words. And this is relating to Giambattista Vico in The New Science, who says that language probably began with sort of sub-audible grunts or onomatopoeia or screams or yelps or things like this. Things that are kind of pre-phonetic, pre-speech, and yet they are still sounds, and they have something to do with the materiality and the physicality and the embodied nature of early peoples. So here they're having this back and forth, and they just can't seem to find a common conceptual vocabulary by which to understand each other, because the physical and cultural vocabulary goes hand in hand with their ability to use concepts in order to understand each other. And they have this little dialogue where they're going back and forth, and Jute says, "What a horrible thing to be called. How, Mute?" So he, is kind of tripping over his words, horrible. But also, there's a mix between audible here, but also horrible, said with a very posh British accent, where the R is not silent, but it is articulated lightly. Ra. Horrible, instead of horrible, right? So we're getting this sort of patronizing mimicking of a very high-class accent. "Oh, what a horrible thing that is. What are we to do?" And he's bearing that against mute, trying to castigate him for his muteness, for his inability, and perhaps his not desiring to use this strictly conceptual, framed, official discourse by which to understand the other person. And this is part of the reason that Finnegans Wake is so resistant to interpretation and to reading in general, because it naturally is rereading itself in light of its inability to already have in advance a common conceptual scheme by which to come to an interpretation, by which to engage in the act of reading. Joyce understands that he himself is one person and his readers are each individual people bearing their own conceptual stamps and bringing their own tools and tactics to bear on the text. And as such, textuality is naturally aware of its own capacity for divergence because it is intimately related to the readers, which actually activate and breathe the breath of life into the text. And they must do this breathing through speech, for example. Just 2 pages later, Joyce writes, "Stoop if you are absent-minded to this clay book. What curious of signs! Please stoop in this aleph bed. Can you read, since we and thou had it out already, its world?" Right, so this is a very self-reflexive passage about the ability of the reader to actually read this aleph bed, right, this bed of alephs, so a Hebrew letter. But absent-minded is what I'm really interested in. Now, this is absent-minded. This is also A, B, C, D, E, where the D and the E have switched places. And it's absent-minded, but said as if the speaker has nasal congestion. Because when you have your nose closed and you try to say an N sound, you can't do it because N is a nasally tone. So if I tried to say absent-minded, it would sound absent-minded. So hence he's actually orthographically altering the word not only to serve as a portmanteau, but to signal the bodily state of the speaker. So by bringing accents and sort of alterations beyond the scope of accents, we focus on the particularity of the speaker and on the reader, of the instantiator, who is the condition by which we are even looking at this text. And if we look at the condition of HCE, for example, he is marred by all sorts of bodily maladies. He has a stutter, so he's constantly tripping over his speech at often very crucial and unfortunate moments. He also has a lot of stomach problems. He also is losing his eyesight or has completely lost it. Sometimes he's hard of hearing. Sometimes he seems to have a speech impediment with regards to certain words. There's all sorts of reasons why he has trouble being understood because of his inability to speak normally, to speak straight English, so to speak. In Book 2, Chapter 1, The Mime of the Mick, Nick, and the Maggies, Shem and Sean are playing a game with their sister Izzy and the 28 or 29 Rainbow Girls, in which Shem is asked to try to guess the color of the panties of Izzy and the Rainbow Girls. And the correct answer is heliotrope. And this is a purposefully ambiguous color/word. It's a concept which always seems to flee beyond Shem's ability to guess it. And there's a point where they're actually trying to spell out how to even pronounce this word because it seems so conceptually and phonetically foreign to Shem because they're trying to just spell out plain English. Oh, if you just go into enough detail, this will be made easy. But no, in fact, it actually kind of ironically shows the difficulties that go on in even speaking very basic words. And it goes to show the extent to which Joyce was focused on the particularities of pronunciation of what's going on in the mouth. And they're trying to describe how do you pronounce the word trope, because they roll their R's because they're, these romantic romance language using girls. And it says, "Arise, land under wave, clap your lingua to your palate, drop your jowl with a jolt, tambourine until your breath slides, pet a pout and it's out." Right? So the land under wave is the tongue under the wave of sound and air that's going over it. And first, you have to clap your lingua to your palate, tap your tongue to the top of your mouth. Then you have to drop your jowl, actually lower it, and then tambourine until your breath slides and you pet a pout. You literally, this is onomatopoeically describing making the P sound, and then it's out. Trop. So he's very detailedly going into the manner in which we speak words in a very ironic way. And the focus on accents is going to take us way back in history to the Old English period, where we get the beginning of the Lord's Prayer in a pseudo-Old English idiom here on page 599. Ure faters dat arid in himmel, hallowed be thy namus. And then it stops and it trails off and does other things. But we can see very clearly that he's trying to emulate this accent idiom, but doing it in a way where it shows that, as he said, I can do anything with language. And I think the real question of Finnegans Wake is, should the readers also be doing anything with language? Should we be willfully diverting from any standard and trying to come up with our own ways of creatively and experimentally reading the text? And I think this is something that is really fun about reading Finnegans Wake, that makes it a real personal experience, and one that I think can allow for really insightful group readings. So that being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat interesting in discussing the particularities of Finnegans Wake and its orthophonetics. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it really helps me get the books needed to bring y'all content. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.